There is a kind of silence that falls when the most powerful man in the county asks a simple question.
And nobody wants to answer it.
Not because they don't know the answer.
Because they do, and they've spent 2 years pretending they didn't.
That silence lasted 4 seconds in a church hall packed with 60 people,
while the rich rancher held up a slice of apple pie and waited.
And at the far end of the last table, in a beige dress washed so thin the color had faded to a rumor,
a woman kept her eyes on her plate and prayed the question was not meant for her. It was meant for her.
And what happened in the 6 months after Walter Holt asked, "Who made this apple pie?" The debt nobody was supposed to know about.
The man quietly circling her land.
The sound of an axe at 2 o'clock in the morning is a story this whole town would spend years trying to live down. Stay with me, because the woman they all looked past is about to become the only person in Cedar Falls worth talking about. Texas Panhandle, October of 1883. The harvest supper at the Cedar Falls church happened every year.
And every year it looked the same. Long tables draped in checkered cloth. 3 of them buckling under food carried in from every kitchen in the county.
Lamplight gold on the walls. And that particular warmth you only find in people who've worked themselves hollow through a hard season and decided,
tonight,
to celebrate having survived it.
Walter Holt arrived at 6:30. He was 48.
The largest landowner in Cedar Falls County, known for 2 things in equal measure, his fortune and his honesty.
He didn't come to many gatherings like this, not out of arrogance, but out of a quieter discomfort no one ever suspected in a man that rich.
He'd been the most important person in every room, for so long that rooms had stopped feeling like rooms, and started feeling like audiences.
He'd come tonight because Reverend Cole had asked him personally.
And because the supper raised money for the county school, and a school,
Walter thought, was worth an evening of being looked at.
He took a plate and moved down the table, the way men like him move through the world, unhurried,
expecting space to be made for him. Then he stopped at the apple pie. He took 1 slice.
He tasted it standing there,
distracted, halfway into a thought about cattle prices. And the thought never finished. He stopped chewing. He looked down at the plate as though it had said something to him. He took another bite slower, deliberate.
He set his fork down.
He looked up and looked around the room.
Who made this apple pie?
His voice was not loud. It never had to be. It carried the way water carries downhill, the voice of a man who has never once had to repeat himself to be heard. The room shifted. The women who'd organized the supper, Margaret Hale, Dorothy Crane, Louise Fairfield, whose names appeared on every committee and every good deed in Cedar Falls, looked at one another with the faint discomfort of people bracing to receive a compliment they already know is meant for somebody else. The question hung in the air,
because the answer was not standing at the dessert table where it should have been. The answer was sitting at the far end of the last table,
in the dim edge of the room where the light gave out, in that faded dress,
staring down at her plate as if the question could not possibly,
in 1,000 years, have anything to do with her.
Her name was Rose Calloway.
She was 29 years old,
and she had been invisible in Cedar Falls for 2 years. Nobody in Cedar Falls had ever sat down and decided to ignore Rose Calloway.
When your husband dies, and you refuse to weep where anyone can see,
and you never once knock on a neighbor's door to ask for help, people begin to look away when you pass them on the boardwalk, because it is so much easier to treat a woman like a ghost than to admit,
out loud, that you didn't have the courage to help her. So they looked away, and a little at a time, she disappeared.
Rose came to Cedar Falls in 1879,
the year she married Thomas Calloway, a good man,
steady and honest and gentle in the way that never announces itself.
He'd inherited a small farm on the south edge of town, 80 acres of good panhandle land, sitting high enough on the plains that the winters brought the deep cold.
A winesap apple tree needs to fruit sweet and true. Thomas worked that ground honestly for 4 years.
Then, in October of 1881,
the fever came through the county,
and it took him. 2 years ago now, and Rose had stayed.
That was the thing Cedar Falls could not quite forgive her for.
Not the debt, not the widow's black, the stain.
Everyone had quietly assumed she'd do the sensible thing, sell the farm,
go back wherever she'd come from,
spare them the discomfort of watching a young widow fail alone.
She had no family here. The reasonable thing was to leave. She did not leave.
She worked that farm with 2 hired hands she could barely afford,
and managed the debt with the pitiless arithmetic of a woman who has no margin for a single mistake. She planted, harvested, hauled her crop to market, haggled for every cent. and made every payment on time to the day.
Never once late, and she showed up.
To every supper, every funeral, every county event, because showing up was the price of belonging. And Rose Calloway was determined to belong to a place that had decided, without ever quite saying so, that she did not. She brought food to every gathering. Nobody asked her to. She'd brought the apple pie tonight, her mother's recipe.
The apples off the winesap tree Thomas had planted on the east side their first year together. The tree, she still tended, the way some women tend a grave.
Because it was the last living thing her husband had put into the world with his own 2 hands. She'd set the pie down without a word and taken her seat at the far end, in the dim, where nobody was likely to look at her directly.
And she'd been sitting there a full hour invisible in a room full of people, when the richest man in the county held up a slice of her mother's pie and asked who on earth had made it.
The silence stretched. 4 seconds. Margaret Hale looked at the pie. She looked at Walter Holt. She looked at Dorothy Crane beside her. Then Dorothy Crane said, smoothly, "I believe several of us contributed to the dessert table, Mr. Holt," which was true, and which answered nothing. Walter did not blink. He looked down at the pie on his plate. "I didn't ask who contributed to the dessert table," he said, pleasantly, without an edge which somehow made it land harder.
"I asked who made this pie."
And another silence began.
But this one broke.
Because at the far end of the last table, Rose Calloway lifted her eyes from her plate. "I did," she said. Walter Holt turned. Rose held his gaze. "Mrs. Calloway," Reverend Cole said quietly from across the room, as if reminding them all that she had a name. And then Walter Holt did the thing that made 60 people forget how to breathe. He pulled out the empty chair across from her, and he sat down. In front of everyone, "This," he said, "is the best apple pie I have eaten in 20 years. I very much like to know how you make it." Rose looked at this man. "It's my mother's recipe," she said. "From Georgia. Tell me about it." And here is the thing that undid something in her chest before she could stop it. He meant it. She could hear that he meant it. So she told him, "The winesap apples off Thomas's tree, a variety that needs a hard, cold winter to fruit right, which is why the high Panhandle worked when the softer country to the south never could. The cinnamon ground fresh,
Not shaken from a tin sitting on a shelf since before the war.
the crust worked with lard and cold water until it was right, and then knowing when to stop. Because a crust worked 1 minute past right is ruined." Walter listened, truly listened. Then he asked 2 questions. One about her oven temperature, one about the ratio of sugar to fruit. And they were good questions. She blinked at him. "You cook." "I did," he said. Something moved behind his eyes and settled. "Before, my wife was a remarkable cook. I learned to pay attention, sitting with her. Before, she heard the whole shape of a grief inside that one word, because she carried the same word herself." The room gradually went back to its own conversations. Not entirely, but enough. Then Margaret Hale appeared at the table, wearing the composed smile of a woman moving to set a disrupted order back to rights. "Mrs. Calloway, we were hoping you might help clear the dessert table once the supper's finished." Rose began to rise. "Mrs. Calloway and I are in the middle of a conversation," Walter said, pleasantly, a simple statement of fact. And it stopped Margaret Hale like a wall. She returned to the dessert table. Rose sat back down, her heart doing something complicated. "I apologize," Walter said quietly, "if I've made things difficult for you." "You didn't," she said. "How long have you been in Cedar Falls?" he asked. 4 years. Thomas Calloway's farm, he said. The 80 acres on the south edge. I knew Thomas. She went very still. "He was a good man," Walter said. "Steady, honest." "Yes," she said. And her voice did something it hadn't done in 2 years. "He was." And then they talked about Thomas. For 20 minutes. 20 whole minutes. In the corner of a crowded room, while the richest man in the county asked a widow to tell him about the husband she'd lost, and listened to every word as though the dead man had been real, and worth remembering, and a loss to the world. It was the first time in 2 years that anyone in Cedar Falls had spoken to Rose about Thomas as if he'd ever existed at all. When she finally walked home that night, down the dark road with the enormous Panhandle stars burning cold above her, she understood that something had shifted under her feet. She did not yet know what. Walter Holt rode home the long way that night. He told himself it was to see the tree, a winesap that could produce apples good enough for a pie like that,
was a tree worth knowing about. The Calloway farm sat visible from the road in the October moonlight.
The house small but kept up, the barn solid, and the south pasture. He slowed his horse. Fence clean and tight with a new Glidden barbed wire, the kind that had been carving up the open range since '74, and starting fence-cutting wars that sent men riding out at midnight with pliers and old grudges. He looked at that fence a long time, on a spread the size of his. Good fence was maintenance, on a farm like Rose Calloway's good land, surrounded by big operations that would much rather see it thrown back open to their cattle. Good fence was survival. A woman drawing a line in the dirt and daring the whole county to cross it. He rode on. And in the morning, he went to see Harlan Briggs. Harlan ran the Cedar Falls lending office from behind a desk that always had too many papers on it and never quite enough light. He was 50, precise, and had always struck Walter as a man who understood, better than most, the market value of other people's troubles. Walter mentioned the Calloway farm. In passing, the way you mention the weather. 160 on the note, Harlan said, of which 47's due December 1st. She's been making the payments. Everyone, on time, never missed a day. Then he leaned back, and Walter watched something calculating settle into the man's face. But the 47 comes due all at once, and she doesn't have it yet. He leaned forward and lowered his voice, as though what came next were a kindness. I'll be honest with you, Walter. I've had an inquiry, an investor from outside the county, looking at small properties. He's made an offer to purchase the Calloway note. Walter went very still, the way still water goes still before weather. Purchase the note. If she misses December 1st by so much as a single day, the new holder can adjudicate immediately. No public auction. No grace period. Harlan spread his hands. All reasonableness. Standard procedure for a transferred note. Walter looked at the ledger, then at Harlan. And who is this investor? Harlan's eyes moved, just slightly, just to the left. I'm not at liberty to say. At this stage, Walter held the man's gaze until the silence became its own kind of answer. I see, he said. He set his hat on his head. Thank you, Harlan. He sat on his horse outside that lending office a long time. He thought about a woman who'd made something extraordinary and gone an entire hour without a single soul saying her name. About $47, and a note quietly for sale. And an investor who wanted no auction, no witnesses, no daylight. And he thought carefully about exactly what he was and was not going to do about it. Because here's what a lesser man would have done. He'd have ridden straight to that farm, laid $47 on the kitchen table, and felt like a hero doing it. Walter Holt was not going to do that. He'd understood something the moment she said I did, in that dim corner. Rose Calloway did not need rescuing. A woman who'd held 80 acres against a whole town's indifference for 2 years did not need a rich man to swoop in, pay her debts, and turn her in one stroke into a project, a charity. A thing that had been saved, that would take the one thing she had left, her dignity, and she'd rather lose the farm than lose that, and he knew it. Because in her place, so would he. So he did not pay the debt. He did something much harder. He decided to make her difficulties smaller, without ever once letting her feel small. He knocked on her door on a Thursday morning. Rose answered with flour to her wrists and the guarded expression of a woman interrupted mid-work. Mr. Holt. Mrs. Calloway. I wondered if I might see the apple tree. I've been turning over what you told me at the supper. I've an east-facing slope on my land that might suit a wine sap, and I'd like to see how a good one's kept. She looked at him with eyes that saw things clearly. She'd been lied to gently by kinder-seeming people, and she knew the difference between a man who wanted something from her and a man who was, for reasons she couldn't yet name, trying to give her a way to stand on her own feet. Come around the side of the house, she said. She showed him the tree, and they stood under its bare October branches while she talked about the variety and the harvest, and he listened with his whole attention. Then he asked to see the south pasture fence. He had a man he was thinking of hiring, and wanted to see the fellow's work first. He crouched, ran a gloved hand along the wire, checked the tension, the depth of the posts. Good work. The man who did this is, he local, Pete Dawson, works by the day. I'd like to offer him 2 weeks on my north section. And I'd like to pay you a finder's fee for the recommendation, $5. Her chin came up. That's not how finder's fees work, Mr. Holt. I own a great deal of land, he said evenly.
Knowing which men do honest work is genuinely worth $5 to me.
He held her gaze, and his voice softened. Just enough. I'm not trying to rescue you, Mrs. Calloway. I know better than that. I'm trying to be useful to you in a way that doesn't cost you a thing you'd hate to lose. $3, she said. He almost laughed. All right, 3. And she almost smiled. The real one. The one that changed her whole face and arrived without warning, like sun through a break in cloud there, and gone before she could think better of it. Before we ride on, I want to ask you something.
Most of you are somewhere in the middle of your own day, driving,
Washing dishes, folding laundry, watching the evening come down. And this voice is keeping you company while you do it. That's what USA West Stories is for. If Rose and Walter have gotten hold of you tonight,
do me one small kindness and leave a like. It tells more people the story's worth their time.
and it means more than you know. And tell me in the comments, what are you doing right now while you listen? I read them. I want to know who's out there in the dark with me tonight. Now let's get back to it. Because Walter Holt has just learned that Rose Calloway isn't only racing a calendar she can't beat. Somebody wants her land, and he has a name. October became November. Walter kept coming back, and every time, with a real reason. He didn't invent excuses. He found true ones. His spread was vast, his needs genuine. And Rose Calloway's knowledge of which men did honest work turned out to be exact. Pete Dawson did fine work on the north fence, just as she'd promised. He mentioned it on his next visit, which happened to fall the same morning she needed to talk through the water rights on her east section. He knew water rights the way other men know their own names. She knew the ground down to the last stone, so the visits became a pattern, not announced, not arranged. Just real. Tuesday mornings, sometimes Thursday afternoons. Then, the third week of November, one of her 2 hired hands quit. Found better paying work in town. 2 days notice. Fair enough. And gone. Which meant Rose Calloway was now 1 man short, with 4 weeks until December 1st. $16 still to raise. And the long shadow of an investor she wasn't even supposed to know about falling across everything. She did not tell Walter. Of course, she didn't. Telling him would have looked like asking, and she did not ask. He found out anyway from Pete Dawson, who'd heard it at the feed store. He came on a Tuesday. I heard you lost a hand. I'm managing, she said. I know you are. I also know you're 4 weeks from December 1st, $16 short, and a man down. All at once. He paused. And I know Harlan Briggs has an offer on your note from a man named Victor Marsh, who happens to be Harlan Briggs's brother-in-law, and who has been watching your property for 18 months. Rose went completely still. How do you know that? I asked my lawyer. Back in October, the day Harlan couldn't quite tell me who the investor was. What does a man like that want with 80 acres? He believes the railway survey coming through next year will run close to the south edge of your land. He wants it in his hands before anyone else knows why it's worth wanting. That's why it has to be quiet. That's why it can't wait for an auction. The whole plan depends on you never seeing it coming. She turned and looked at her farm, at the cattle, at that barbed wire fence, holding the open range at bay, at the winesap tree, bare against the November sky, the last thing Thomas ever planted. Then she looked back at Walter. What do I do? And it landed on both of them. The weight of it, because it was the first time in 2 years of managing alone that Rose Calloway had asked another living soul that question. Walter did not reach for his wallet. You give me your permission to go speak with Harlan Briggs, not to pay your debt, to inform him, plainly, that selling a note to his own brother-in-law without disclosing the conflict is a matter the county recording office would find very interesting to hear about. He held her gaze. And you let me send 2 of my men to help with the cattle for 2 weeks, so your last hand can put his hours where they're needed. That's all. You'll owe every dollar you owe today. Nothing changes on the ledger. I'm only clearing the road of obstacles that were never yours to begin with. She looked at him for a long time. All right, she said. And then, softer, a word she hadn't spent on anyone in a very long while. Thank you, he went. And Rose stood in her own yard and felt something she hadn't felt since the fever took Thomas. Not relief, but the steadying feeling of being seen completely by a man who understood exactly what he was looking at and had decided it was worth protecting. Walter's conversation with Harlan Briggs was brief and very clear.
Harlan understood legal exposure the instant it was laid in front of him. Victor Marsh's inquiry was quietly withdrawn the very next day. The note stayed exactly where it had always been, $47. Due December 1st. Held by the Cedar Falls lending office, and not one page of it transferred to anybody's scheming brother-in-law.
Rose never learned the words Walter used.
She only knew that Harlan Briggs stopped mentioning any investor the next time she came to make a payment.
That was enough. November the 21st. She counted it out on her kitchen table by lamplight. $39.
8 short.
9 days left.
She was still sitting over the accounts, doing the arithmetic again, as though the numbers might have mercy on the second pass,
when she heard hoofbeats on the road.
then boots on her porch.
More than one pair. Then a knock. Reverend Cole stood on her porch, and behind him Pete Dawson and his wife, the Hendersons, old Mr.
Marsh, from the feed store.
4, 5.
6 more faces from the congregation.
Breath fogging in the cold, hats in their hands. Mrs. Calloway. We've been talking. He held something out to her. Not an envelope. Not money. A piece of paper handwritten and signed.
She saw as she took it in shaking hands.
By 30 families of Cedar Falls.
This is not charity, he said,
Before she could even read it,
as though he knew that word would shut the door faster than any refusal.
this is a work order
50 apple pies for the county Thanksgiving bazaar, to be delivered in 5 days. He met her eyes.
We'll pay you the going market rate for everyone,
Every cent you earn is yours.
and you'll have earned it with your own 2 hands. Rose looked at the paper. 30 names.
She looked up at the faces crowding her small porch in the cold, the same faces that had looked past her on the boardwalk for 2 years, the same town that had let her carry food to their tables and never once said her name.
She thought about all of it. 2 years of showing up.
2 years of bringing something and not making a fuss. 2 years of being a ghost. And she thought about a question a rich man had asked in October,
In the dim end of a crowded room.
that had apparently set something moving in this community she was only now beginning to see the shape of.
50 pies, she said. Her voice did not shake. She would not let it.
In 5 days.
Yes, can you do it?
She looked down at her own hands, flour-scarred.
Work hard. Capable.
I'll need 3 times the wood I've got,
It's already stacked by the barn.
Pete Dawson said.
We hauled it over this afternoon. She looked past all of them,
Out to the dark shape of the woodpile by the barn, a wall of split logs where this morning there'd been almost nothing.
She looked at the wood, at the people, at the paper with 30 names on it.
I accept,
She said. 5 days, 50 pies,
the last of the wine saps off Thomas's tree, everyone.
the whole end of the season's harvest, picked to the bare branch, cinnamon ground fresh until her arm ached,
Crust worked with lard and cold water,
over and over,
until it was right and stopped.
every time. Exactly where right ended.
Rose worked before the sun came up and long after it went down.
Her last hired hand handled the apples by the bushel.
The kitchen ran hot as a forge, the cast iron stove eating through wood at a rate she'd never once sustained. She slept 3 hours the first night,
4 the second.
On the third night,
At 2 o'clock in the morning, the wood ran low.
she went out to the pile by the barn,
Lantern swinging.
breath ghosting in the black cold, and found it lower than it had any right to be.
She'd burned more than she'd figured, which meant, when she did the arithmetic there in the freezing dark,
That the morning would come, and the fire would die under the last of the pies, and they would not be done in time.
not by the bazaar. And then, from around the far side of the barn, in the dead middle of that frozen night, she heard it. The steady bite of an axe into wood. She went around the corner of the barn, slow, her heart in her throat. Walter Holt was standing at the chopping block, in his good wool coat,
By the light of a single lantern,
splitting wood, in the deep cold, at 2 o'clock in the morning, with the quiet,
focused efficiency of a man who knows exactly how to do a hard thing and has no interest in being watched doing it.
He had not knocked. He had not called out.
He had not ridden up to her door and offered his help and waited to be thanked for it. He had simply come sometime in the black hours, while she bent over the oven inside, and set himself to the one task that stood between her and the deadline,
and said nothing to anyone.
because he did not want her to owe him a single word of gratitude for it.
Rose stood in the shadow of the barn and watched him. He hadn't heard her come around. He split 3 more lengths, the axe rising and falling, his breath smoking in the lantern light. Then he looked up.
He saw her.
He set the axe down against the block, slowly, the way a man does when he's been caught at something he'd meant to keep private. The fire, he said. Just that. I know, she said. And that was all. Neither of them said one word more. She turned and went back inside to the oven, to the pies, to the work. And he turned back to the block
and went on splitting wood in the freezing dark so that her fire would not go out before the last pie was done.
At 5 in the morning, the final pie went into the oven.
At 6:30,
it came out golden, even, correct. Rose sat down at her kitchen table. She laid both hands flat on the worn wood, and she just breathed for a moment. The way you breathe when a thing that could not possibly be finished has, somehow, been finished. Outside, the axe had gone quiet hours ago, but when she walked out to the barn in the gray dawn,
there was enough split wood stacked against its wall to last her 2 full weeks.
She went back inside. She made coffee, and she waited, quietly, for the sun to finish coming up. She delivered all 50 pies to the county Thanksgiving bazaar on the 26th of November. Every one of them sold before noon. And on the 29th,
Rose Calloway walked into the Cedar Falls lending office with $47 in silver Morgan dollars worn smooth with handling, wrapped in a clean cloth that had sat folded on her kitchen table since the hour she'd finally counted enough of them into it. She set the cloth on Harlan Briggs's desk.
She unfolded it, and she stood, straight-backed, while he counted the coins, and stamped the ledger, and slid the receipt across the desk. Farms clear, Mrs. Calloway. Thank you, she said. She walked back out onto the boardwalk, stood in the hard November cold, and looked down at the small square of paper in her hand. The farm was clear, and it was hers. She walked home under the wide, cold sky. And for the first time in a very long time, the road did not feel quite so long. Walter came by on the Thursday. She told him everything: the bazaar, the 50 pies, the silver dollars, the receipt. She told it plainly, the way she told him everything now.
Reverend Cole surprised me, she said.
People generally do, Walter said, when someone finally gives them the chance to. She looked at him a long moment. You said something to him before he came to my door with 30 names on a piece of paper. He did not lie to her. He never had.
I mentioned to Reverend Cole that I'd been thinking about the harvest supper, about how some of the things a person gives to a community go unacknowledged for a long time for reasons that have nothing to do with what they're worth.
He looked out at the farm. I didn't tell him what to do. I only mentioned it. What the town did after that, the town did on its own.
Rose held his gaze, and then she said his name for the first time.
Walter. He looked at her. The wood, she said. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he said nothing. And Victor Marsh. And Harlan Briggs. He said nothing. You've been very careful, she said. And her voice was not quite steady now.
Not to rescue me.
You didn't need rescuing, he said simply. You needed the obstacles that were never yours removed. There's a difference. I thought you, of all people, deserved to have someone see it. She looked at him a long time. The Panhandle morning was cold and clear and bright, and the winesap tree stood bare against it, patient, rooted, permanent, waiting on a spring that hadn't come yet. Thank you, she said, for all of it. He held her eyes. The pie was worth asking about. So was the woman who made it. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she said, "Coffee's on." "Yes," he said, and he followed her inside. December was the month things changed out in the open. The Tuesday mornings and Thursday afternoons quietly became suppers. First at her farm, then at his house. And the talk that had been fence lines and feed prices stretched longer and ran deeper than land ever could. He told her about Ellen, his wife, 5 years gone now, lost in the delivery of a child who had not survived either. He told it the way he told everything hard, plainly, without asking for anything, offering it as something he wanted her to have, because she'd come to matter enough to be trusted with it. She told him about Thomas, more than the 20 minutes at the supper, the first year on the farm, everything they'd planned, everything the fever took, and what she'd decided, alone, to do with what was left. And the town was watching the whole time. Of course it was. Cedar Falls would always watch. That was the nature of Cedar Falls. But the watching had softened. It had learned something. Margaret Hale brought a peach pie out to the farm in December, with a note tucked under the cloth that said only, "I should have said something at the supper." Asterisk. On an evening in January, sitting out on Walter's porch with the mild winter settled soft around them, he said, I have a practical question. All right. The Calloway farm. 80 acres. South edge of town. Good land.
A winesap tree on the east side.
He looked at her. I'd like to propose we file a joint land agreement. Both names on the deed, but each of us keeping full, independent ownership. Neither person's property subordinate to the other's, under Texas law. My lawyer in Amarillo can draw it up clean. She looked at him slowly. You've been talking to your lawyer about a woman's property rights under Texas law. Since November, she repeated. There's a provision in the Texas statutes, he said, that preserves a woman's right to her own land as separate property.
Even inside a marriage, if it's properly documented beforehand.
Before any ceremony. He held her gaze, very steady, very serious. I want to be completely clear. Rose, the Calloway farm is yours. It was Thomas's before it was yours, and it will be yours long after whatever comes next. I am not asking for your land. I'd sign a paper tonight swearing I'll never touch an acre of it. She looked at him a long moment. Then what? She said quietly. Are you asking for? He looked up at the January stars, hard and bright over the plains, then back at her. Rose Calloway. Would you be willing to stop being invisible? She held his eyes, steady as bedrock. I was never invisible. The town just wasn't paying attention. I know, Walter said. And something in the way he said it broke a little and healed a little, all at once. I was. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. She held it back, and the January night held the two of them there on the porch. And out on the east side of the Calloway farm,
The winesap tree that Thomas planted stood in the dark, with its roots buried deep in the Panhandle soil, patient,
permanent, waiting, the way it had waited through every winter, for the spring it knew was coming. They were married in April.
in the Cedar Falls church, the same room where the harvest supper happened every October.
Where Walter Holt had asked one honest question 6 months before and set all of this into motion. The ceremony was exactly the right size. The congregation, the neighbors, the people of Cedar Falls, who had been paying much closer attention since November. Rose wore blue.
Walter stood at the altar and watched her come down that aisle.
And he thought about a woman at the end of the last table.
In a dress washed so thin the color had faded to a rumor. A woman who'd lifted her eyes with the quiet composure of someone overlooked one time too many.
And finished. At long last, pretending it didn't hurt.
And she walked toward him, thinking about a man in a good wool coat,
Splitting wood by lantern light at 2 in the morning, in the killing cold, asking for nothing. So a fire would not go out before the last pie was done. After the ceremony, in the church hall, there was a supper.
and in the center of the dessert table where the light was brightest now,
And where everyone could see it,
sat a single apple pie.
Rose had made it the morning of her own wedding, the last of the winesaps put up from Thomas's tree, cinnamon ground fresh,
Crust worked until it was right.
and stopped where right ended. She'd made it because it was her mother's recipe, and because bringing something was simply who she was.
And because some things are worth doing, whether or not a single soul ever thinks to thank you for them.
Walter found it on the table. He took a slice. He tasted it, standing there. He set his fork down, and he looked out across the room at the 60 people of Cedar Falls, at Margaret Hale and Dorothy Crane, at Reverend Cole and Pete Dawson and Old Mister,
Marsh at all the faces of a community that had spent 6 months.
at real cost, learning how to see. Who made this apple pie? He asked. And the room laughed. Not uncomfortably, not this time. The real laugh, the warm one, the kind that comes from people who understand exactly what they're hearing. No, they had a part in it, and find that it was earned. From across the bright room, Rose Calloway, who was now, and would be from that day forward. Rose Holt looked at her husband and answered the question with the same 2 words she'd answered it the very first time. I did. It's the best apple pie I've ever eaten, he said. I know, she said.
And the Cedar Falls church hall was full and warm and loud with good laughter.
And outside, on the east side of the Calloway farm,
The winesap tree that Thomas planted was breaking into bud in the soft April light, its roots deep in the Panhandle soil.
patient and permanent, exactly as it had always been. Walter Holt tasted an apple pie at a church supper in October, and he asked one question. Who made this? Asterisk. Not to be kind, not to make a point.
Not to teach anyone a lesson.
He asked because the pie was extraordinary, and because the question was honest, and because he was a man who asked honest questions and expected honest answers.
And the answer was sitting at the end of the last table, in a dress washed so many times the color had become more suggestion than fact.
That's the whole story.
A question asked out loud, in a room full of people who already knew the answer and had chosen,
Without ever quite deciding not to say it. Walter Holt looked, and when Walter Holt looked at something in Cedar Falls, eventually looked too. Not all at once,
not without cost, 50 apple pies,
and 5 days, and 3 hours of sleep a night,
and a man splitting wood by lantern light at 2 in the morning.
so a fire would not go out before the last pie was done. Because the best things in any room are rarely the ones sitting in the center of it. Sometimes they're at the end of the last table,
In the dim,
overlooked, waiting patiently.
for someone honest enough to ask the right question. May God bless each and every one of you listening today.
And until next time, keep the fire lit.
This has been USA West Stories. To the most beautiful woman I have ever known. Asterisk.
Oh, Henry. Asterisk. I am the luckiest man alive. Asterisk.
Asterisk.
But that's a story for next time. Asterisk.